There is a specific moment in every diagnosis, real or imagined, where the person doing the diagnosing stops describing what they see and starts describing what they believe. A doctor in an examination room knows the difference because the room forces them to know it. There is a patient, there is a chart, there is a license on the wall that can be taken away if they get it wrong in writing. Take away the room, though. Take away the chart, the consent form, the 20 years of training on the differential diagnosis, and replace all of it with a laptop, a YouTube upload button, and 45 seconds of slowed-down rally footage. And something strange happens to that same profession. The certainty stays exactly the same. Everything that used to justify the certainty quietly disappears. I mention this not because I have a personal grudge against amateur neurology, though give me a minute and you may suspect otherwise, but because this exact process has become one of the most reliable engines of political content in America, and almost nobody is talking about the engine itself. Everyone is too busy watching the footage. So let's talk about the footage. And more specifically, let's talk about what's actually being sold to you underneath it. Good evening, or good morning, or good 3 in the morning, because you couldn't sleep and started doom scrolling, whichever applies. I'm Marcus Fenn, this is Borderlines, and tonight we are not doing what you might expect from the title. We are not going to spend 20 minutes analyzing Donald Trump's gait, his hand, his hair, or the particular way he mispronounces the word responding at rallies. Other channels have that extremely well covered, some of them multiple times a week, which is itself the first data point worth sitting with. What we are going to do is take the genre apart. The rally clips, the Oval Office comparisons, the licensed professional, standing in front of a bookshelf explaining what a twitching elbow probably means. We're going to look at how that content is built, why it performs the way it does, what happens when you check its claims against what the actual medical and psychological professions say about this kind of analysis. And this is the part that actually matters for the country, so stay with me. What it's doing to the American public's relationship with uncertainty itself, because that relationship is not a small thing. It is arguably the whole thing. Let's start with the format, because the format is doing a tremendous amount of work before a single medical claim is even made. Nearly every video in this genre opens the same way. There's a warm, almost apologetic disclaimer. This is not a diagnosis, these are just my opinions, delivered in the first 30 seconds, and then never referenced again for the following 15 minutes, which is, of course, precisely how you want a disclaimer to function if your actual goal is coverage rather than caution. You say it once, early, quietly, so that later, if anyone objects, you can point back to mine at 1 and say, well, I did say it wasn't a diagnosis. Meanwhile, the other 14 minutes are constructed entirely out of diagnostic language. Myoclonus, neurological changes, post-stroke presentation, impaired judgment. These are not vague impressions. These are specific clinical terms deployed with clinical confidence about a person the presenter has never examined, never spoken with, and has access to only through heavily edited video clips selected, out of hours of footage, specifically because they support the argument already being made before the footage was chosen. That's not analysis finding a conclusion. That's a conclusion going shopping for footage. I want to be fair here, because fairness is annoying but necessary. Public figures absolutely should be scrutinized. Fitness for office is a legitimate question, and it has been asked about presidents of every party for as long as the office has existed. Ask anyone who lived through the final year of a certain wartime president's 4th term, or the extended public silence around a different president's stroke in 1919, both of which were real stories that real journalism eventually uncovered through real reporting. The problem here is not that the question is being asked. The problem is the method being used to answer it, and the confidence with which that method is presented as though it were the same thing as the method journalism actually uses. So here's what the professional bodies who oversee exactly this kind of claim actually say about it. The American Psychiatric Association has, since 1973, maintained something called the Goldwater Rule, named after the 1964 incident where a magazine polled psychiatrists about Barry Goldwater's fitness for office and published diagnoses from professionals who had never met him. The rule states plainly that Offering a professional opinion about the mental state of a public figure, a psychiatrist has not personally examined and does not have proper authorization to discuss, is unethical. The American Psychological Association has adopted parallel guidance for psychologists. Neurologists operate under similar professional norms. You cannot diagnose myoclonus or any movement disorder from a video clip, because myoclonus is a symptom with dozens of possible causes ranging from completely benign to serious, and distinguishing between them requires an actual clinical examination, sometimes imaging, sometimes blood work, not a freeze frame of someone's elbow at a podium. None of this is controversial inside the professions themselves. It is, in fact, close to a settled consensus, which raises the obvious question: if the guardrails are this clear and this well established, why does this content keep getting made? And more importantly, why does it keep working? And here, of course, is where we get to the part that actually explains everything else. It works because uncertainty is exhausting, and certainty, even fake certainty, even certainty built out of 45 seconds of selectively edited video, is a relief. Americans right now are being asked to hold an enormous number of genuinely uncertain, genuinely high-stakes questions at once. Questions about the economy, about foreign policy, about who exactly is making decisions and how sound those decisions are. An uncertainty of that scale is deeply uncomfortable to sit inside for very long. A video that says, with total confidence, here is exactly what is wrong, and here is exactly why it explains everything, does not just entertain you, it does something closer to soothing you in the way a diagnosis, even a wrong one, can feel better than not knowing. You now have an explanation. The explanation has a doctor's voice. It comes with a lower third that says clinical and forensic psychologist, which sounds exactly like the kind of authority that should be trusted, and which most viewers, quite reasonably, have no way of independently verifying against the actual clinical standards that authority is supposed to be bound by. Now, think about what that does at scale, over months, across an entire media ecosystem, applied to a sitting president. It doesn't just shape opinions about one man's health. It reshapes what an entire audience considers to be evidence. If a slowed-down clip and a confident voiceover count as evidence, then everything becomes provable about everyone, all the time, by anyone with a webcam and a subscribe button. That is not a small cultural shift. That is the erosion of the actual distinction between analysis and assertion. And once an audience stops being able to tell those two things apart, they become available for exactly the same technique to be used against literally any public figure, on literally any topic, by literally anyone with a large enough following and a confident enough voice. Today it's framed as concern about a president's neurological health. Tomorrow, the exact same toolkit, selective editing, professional-sounding language, one disclaimer up front, gets pointed at an election result, a public health guideline, a court ruling. The method doesn't care what it's used on. It only cares that it works. And we have now spent several years proving at scale that it works extremely well. There's a second cost here too, and it's the one I think gets the least attention, which is exactly why I want to spend a minute on it. Every hour spent parsing whether a president's elbow twitch constitutes myoclonus is an hour not spent on the things about that presidency that are actually, verifiably, provably consequential. Tariff policy that has measurably reshaped trade flows with America's closest allies. Foreign policy decisions with documented, trackable outcomes. Judicial appointments whose effects will outlast this administration by decades. These are not mysterious. They do not require slow-motion video analysis or a psychology license to understand. They require reading the actual policy, the actual numbers, the actual outcomes, which is considerably less viral than a video promising to reveal what nobody else is telling you, but which happens to be the only kind of scrutiny that has ever actually held power accountable for anything. The remote diagnosis genre doesn't just risk being wrong about a health claim, it quietly displaces the harder, less shareable work of tracking what a government is actually doing, and replaces it with the much easier, much more shareable work of speculating about what a government is secretly feeling. None of which means Donald Trump's health, or any president's health, is off limits as a subject. It very much is not. But there is an enormous difference between real reporting on presidential health, the kind that involves actual medical records, actual attending physicians, actual documented incidents, the kind that eventually surface the truth about Woodrow Wilson's stroke or Franklin Roosevelt's declining condition, both stories that took real investigative work and years to properly establish. And a YouTube upload built from rally B-roll and a confident voice reading off a list of neurological terms. One of those is journalism, the other is theater-wearing journalism's coat. And the coat, I will grant, fits reasonably well from a distance. So, where does that leave us, 20 minutes in? No closer to knowing whether any individual clip you've seen means what its narrator claimed it meant. Here, I think, if a video's central evidence is a slowed-down clip, and its central credential is a single disclaimer delivered once and never revisited, treat the confidence in that video as the product being sold, not the finding being reported. Ask who actually has access to real medical information, attending physicians, released records, on-the-record hospital statements, because that is where an actual answer would eventually come from, if there ever is one. And ask honestly whether the last video like this that you watched changed anything about how you understood American governance, or whether it simply gave you 45 minutes of the specific satisfying feeling of being let in on something everyone else had missed. Because that feeling, it turns out, is the actual product. The president's elbow was never really the point. It was just the delivery mechanism. Donald Trump may be perfectly healthy, or he may not be. I genuinely do not know. And neither, with any real confidence, does anyone narrating a rally clip from a home studio. What I do know is that an entire cottage industry has built itself around presenting that same uncertainty as though it were settled science. And that industry is going to keep growing for exactly as long as it keeps getting rewarded with views, which, going by the numbers, is going to be for quite a while yet. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you think American political media could use a little more scrutiny turned back on itself, subscribe, because that's precisely the kind of thing this channel is going to keep doing. The most convincing diagnosis, as it turns out, is very often the one nobody actually had the authority to make.